Hello and welcome to Presence. I'm Doug King. I appreciate you joining me for this last part of our study on integral theology. If you've seen all of the previous sessions, you know that our trajectory has been to move from form to transform to formlessness. And in doing so, we have used spiral dynamics specifically to show that first tier in spiral dynamics would correspond to form, specifically attachment to form, and that which was part of Adam, Abraham, Moses, David, all the way up through the Hebrew people to the time of Jesus. And then Jesus introduces transform. As Jesus said, I come to make all things new. Jesus did not come to modify things by bringing a new religion. If Jesus was a great modifier, instead of bringing all things new, then we would expect Jesus to bring a religion. And the way it would work would be, you know how you guys used to meet on the Sabbath day? Well, I'm going to modify that. Now we're going to meet on the first day of the week. And you know how you used to have the tribes of Israel? I'm going to modify that. Now we're going to have all the people who believe this particular way and who go to this particular church. And on and on and on. We could do comparisons. You used to have circumcision, we've got baptism. But that was not the pattern that was evolving spiritual consciousness for human beings. So we've moved from that form into Jesus' transform. Jesus, or transform, is not an identity. The body is not an identity. The body is transformative toward a body human, meaning global, human, the blessing of all nations. And that Jesus was pointing to, and the body was pointing to, a coming new heaven and earth. And this heaven and earth wouldn't be one where its consciousness was seen to be in terms of separation and death, meaning that God is other, and even the way I deal with the planet, use its resources, is not really on the basis of stewardship, it's more on the basis of possession. And so all of these things move from a first tier consciousness, if you will, to a transformative consciousness. And that transformative consciousness was everything is one. The Father and I are one. And that brings us into formlessness. And so we'll talk about formlessness as we wrap up the series on integral theology. Now, formlessness. Formlessness, remember, is not the absence of form. So, rather, it is detachment from form. When we looked at the spiral levels and we went from, say, traditional, I'll just start there, and we moved up to modernity and then postmodernity. As you moved up each of those levels, your center of gravity meant that you attached to that particular level for your identity. So when I, in my earlier days, was in the traditional mode, I saw Jesus as a boundary-driven figure, bringing a boundary-driven collective that was separate from all other religions and the rest of the world, and that's why we met with our particular group, but we didn't meet with other groups. That's why other groups met and they didn't meet with us. The reason there are religions is because religions, by their nature, require boundaries that separate. When we move into the formless, the work of Jesus was to bring about the consciousness that when it comes to human identity and the human family collective, there are no boundaries. We are all innately spiritual beings. And the question then becomes, in the formless realm, what are the aspects of that formlessness? And what are the things that make up existence today? Some of these things also were apparent to Jesus when he was able to go from a second-tier perspective and look at the different levels that people were on. So, for example, the religious leaders of his time that were always butting heads with Jesus, they were obviously in a very much a blue meme traditional mode. And because of that, there was such a conflict that eventually they tried to take his life. And eventually the voices rang out, "Crucify him." And this led to the crucifixion of Jesus, where Jesus did not fight back through self as source. This is indicated when he was in the garden. They came to take him away. Peter had a sword. Peter was ready to defend. This would have been a warrior consciousness manifested as the shedding of blood, and instead Jesus told Peter to put the sword down, because that's not the nature of God's kingdom. It's not the nature of God's spirituality. And so Jesus was transforming warrior. He wasn't abandoning that level. He was simply transforming warrior from someone who sheds blood to someone who's willing to give their blood, to someone who is a peacemaker versus someone who is ready to engage through the self or ego in defense of its own level of consciousness. And then if we also think about the cross event in and of itself, when Jesus was on the cross, anyone who's coming from a theological background knows that his statements on the cross involved one that was, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Jesus understood that forgiveness is a natural fruit of consciousness when one looks at the actions of people on the basis of what level of consciousness or page number their actions come from. So Jesus looked at the crowd. He knew what was happening. He understood while he was at a level of oneness with the Father, they were not seeing the things he was seeing, and that was leading to their actions. And so Jesus is asking for forgiveness for them because he understood what page number they were on. Now, in my earlier days, when I moved from a traditional center of gravity in my thinking to a more modern or open, that's the orange meme, modernity questions. And I begin to question. And when you begin to question, you start causing problems. And then I began to deconstruct, and then I began to form new interpretations that were different from the religious leaders who I had the utmost respect for and had worked with all my life in various settings. Now, what was my attitude? My attitude was I attached to my questioning, my evolution into questioning and deconstruction. And so because I attached to that, I looked at them and said to them, "You're the ones that have the problem." So what emotions did I feel? I ended up being frustrated. I would be angry. And you go around saying, what is their problem? They just don't get it. Well, that's because that's a first-tier experience that is going to happen because that's the way consciousness evolves. But as you move further and further in the consciousness, you understand why Jesus said, "They know not what they do, therefore forgive them." You want the same forgiveness for yourself. Every day I realize that my consciousness is going to grow more tomorrow to greater places than it is today, and I want that type of grace, if you will, to have the ability to grow and even to look back on things in my life and realize, yes, at that time I did things that I would never have done today. But yet, on the other hand, to understand that we're all products of an evolutionary growth. This is then formlessness. It's formlessness because you're able to become the observer in second tier of all first tier levels. When we talk about kids growing up and the material they learn in school, the way we talk about that is all the children in first grade, second grade, third grade are given material to learn that's age appropriate. For me, there are some 7 billion people on the planet, and I like to use the phrase page appropriate. When we look at all of our other fellow humans on the planet, we can look at them on the basis of what's page appropriate. What page is everyone on with regard to their perspective? And the more I understand the perspective of other people and respect it, not necessarily agree with it, unless that perspective is one that is an unhealthy, warrior, destructive, causing pain, causing bloodshed, causing violence. That's where we need the blue meme. Who's the blue meme? The blue meme would be government armies, police forces. I want the police force to be there with boundaries. I want the police force in blue to deal with the warrior in red who may be a member of a gang or someone who's just out to seek to destroy my life, my family's life, or whatever. All of these have a role or a function. But even if that person who created that kind of situation were put into a prison, we have a lot of people in the integral world right now that are looking to reform the way we do our prison system. That's a formless approach to human challenges, because they'll go into a prison and they will take into account the page number, the background, the situation, circumstances that led to the consequences. And by doing that, that's a forgive them for they know not what they do. Now, that doesn't mean that the consequences of their actions don't require them to perhaps even spend a lifetime in prison, because collectively as humans in a particular country or a particular place, we decided that was what was best, especially to protect all the rest of society. But when we take a formlessness approach, we don't abandon or cut off the person who is struggling with particular problems. Instead, what the question becomes is, how can I contribute to even the most difficult people on the planet? How can I find a way not to excuse them, but to contribute to their well-being? That's a formless approach. So, when we look at boundaries and first tier, we know that boundaries have a role or function, but boundaries are not for the sake of establishing my identity. When we set up boundaries, the paradigm for my identity becomes, am I faithful or unfaithful? Am I saved or am I lost? Am I a believer or an unbeliever? Am I apostate? Am I a heretic? When we use the boundaries with regard to spiritual identity and spiritual evolution for the purpose of establishing a human being's identity, we set ourselves up for continual failure, division, and hostility. Some of the greatest hostility that's ever occurred on the planet and continues to occur is the hostility that's either manifested outwardly by religions or held inside someone's heart and mind because of religion. And many of you today who may be watching this video come from a place where you're spiritual but not religious. And I've seen the phrase on Facebook and in other places many times that actually many of you are saying, I'm spiritual because of religion. And so what we're trying to do is say, look, there is a sacred narrative. I'm not throwing out the sacred narrative. What we're doing is reinterpreting it to say, just because there have been painful experiences by the misuse of a narrative doesn't mean that that's what the narrative was trying to teach us. And so to get rid of a sacred narrative that goes back well over 2,000 years and all the wisdom that comes from that, I think we would be losing the valuable information we can find about spirituality and spiritual consciousness that will help us reflect on how we become a better world in formlessness. Now, when we get into narrative space, the biblical narrative, it's a narrative. There are a lot of narratives out there. If you're talking about Hinduism, you have the Upanishads, or Buddhism and the teaching of Buddha. You've got Taoism, the teachings of Lao Tzu. There are a lot of narratives. Where I am today with the biblical narrative is I like to start conversations by saying, this is the narrative that I have studied and learned and interpreted all my life, and it points me not to itself. It points away from itself to trans-narrative space. And that trans-narrative space is what I believe the narrative itself calls the new heaven and earth. And the new heaven and earth is very interesting the way it's presented in John's Revelation. And the reason why is because you have all this information about the way the world worked, all the way from Adam and the opening of humans' eyes, all the way up to the time of the first century and Jesus. Then Jesus comes and you have this 40-year period that's transformed. It's the last days of first tier, it's the first days of second tier. Then when John says, and now the presence of God is with men, he says this as one of the very last things in the very last chapter and verses of what he wrote before Revelation through the apostolic writers came to an end. And what he says is, okay, The end has happened. Now guess what? We're all in a new heaven and earth. But interestingly enough, he describes the heaven and earth in terms of, well, there's no night there, and we talked about light, darkness, meaning illumination, consciousness, coming to be able to see, which they weren't able to do when Jesus talked to them. That's why he said, having eyes you don't see and ears you don't hear. He wasn't trying to denigrate them as human beings. He was just pointing out the fact that he was talking in one way and they were hearing it in another, and therefore they couldn't hear it and see it. So you have light, that's brought up in the new heaven and earth, and you have a few other aspects. Then that's all that's said. The narrative says no more. So the narrative really doesn't say, what do you do in a new heaven and earth? What do societies look like? What do structures look like? Now, historically, for people who interpret that the world is going to come to an end, God is going to burn up the planet Earth and destroy everything in the universe, their interpretation is, this means everything is in God's hands. Let's not get too excited about all these things that we're saying are problems on the planet, because it's all in God's hands. And what will happen is the planet Earth is going to be destroyed, and then the new heaven and earth is when we all go to an afterlife. And that afterlife is where everything will be okay. That creates the idea then that as long as I'm here, everything will not really be okay. So what's happening here is by the reinterpretation of narrative and saying, I see Jesus and his work as pointing to the integral second tier space. I see Paul and all the apostolic work pointing, John's revelation pointing to this trans-narrative space. Then I'm able to see that I'm now living in the new heaven and earth. And that's a co-creative. And the reason that there isn't any instruction is because the responsibility is on my shoulders. I may seek through prayer divine guidance. I may ask God for help of how to face these challenges. And in fact, I do. But I know now that this is a wonderful, fantastic opportunity to create a better world and be absolutely personally involved in it. That's why I think the younger generations are so much into activism. You see, in my mind, far more activism among the younger generations today than I've ever seen or known in the past. Why is that? They focus on activism because activism doesn't have boundaries. See, when you go out to address climate change or discrimination or sex trafficking or whatever the challenges are on the planet, violence and name a thousand other things, you don't stop and say, well, now if I'm going to work with you on this, you're going to need to give me a profile and let me know what religion you're from and what it is you believe and this, and this. There are no boundaries there, you see. This is a formless approach that says, no, we want to focus on the problems and the problems that need to be solved. Now, at the same time, we're not saying at present that therefore the narrative doesn't matter. What we're saying is, look, we can use the narrative to see the evolution of consciousness and make sure that if we're in activism, that we don't demonize the other side of the people that are causing problems, but rather we not only stop the problem as it is, but we take into consideration how do we communicate effectively with the people that are causing the problems. So, when we get into new heaven and earth, we have really found a narrative whose end has come. The narrative has a beginning. In the beginning, God. Then the narrative has an end. A narrative is specifically for the role or function of telling me a story about who I am, who God is, and the oneness I can experience and do have already with Him. And then to see what that trans-narrative space will be by entering into the age of co-creativity. As I go back to the Genesis, and we talked about this in, I believe, the second section when we got into Abraham as Genesis of faith. When you think about the promises to Abraham, the promise that was the finalization of everything that was to come through Father Abraham was that all the nations of the earth would be blessed. You know, I've talked to people in religion many times, and from either the side of Judaism or the side of Christianity, and I've asked the question, do we really think that God was sitting there thinking, you know, I could take Father Abraham and I could make 3 world religions out of him? Is that really what we think was the intelligence behind the evolution of spirituality? I can see that it involves steps to get to where we are today. But to say that we should expect that there cannot possibly be evolution beyond religion, I believe we'll see in the near future, and certainly within this century, that the views on that will change and are changing drastically. So the promise to Father Abraham we see is something that's happening now. It's a blessing of all the nations. It's not a particularistic, which religions are particularistic. They're boundary-driven entities. Abraham's promise is being fulfilled in what I would describe as a formless way. Now, I'd like to use, and again, I'll give a Bible warning for people that are averse to hearing something read from the Bible. But since this is integral theology, I think it's real important to actually read the narrative from which theology comes, and that's why I start with Adam and go all the way through the prophets and then move through Jesus and the apostles. And I wanted to pull out just a section from Paul that is describing the integral nature of what's happening and how you move into integral second-tier space. And so I'm going to read this and kind of do an exegesis, if you will, as I go along. And then we'll wrap up this section today, and I will finish in part 2 of this on formlessness in our next session. So let me wrap up with this section of writing that Paul did to the Romans, and he's talking about a new creation that's coming to be the fulfillment of the old creation. And most people theologically have interpreted creation in this passage I'm about to read as the planet. And I want us to think about the fact that for Paul, when the followers of Jesus were imitating his death and resurrection, they were being baptized into that death, and they were becoming born again, and they were called new creatures. And Paul saw that these new creatures were making a new creation. And that stood against all the creatures, if you will, that were part of the old creation. And Paul is not talking about the planet Earth. He's talking about 2 different ways of seeing that describe this type of consciousness within people in these tiers from Adam all the way up to Jesus. And then, through the transforming work of Jesus, the consciousness of what will become a new creation, and hence we then become co-creators. And so when Paul wrote this, he starts in Romans chapter 8 by saying, "For the earnest expectation of the creation eagerly waits for the revealing of the sons of God." I believe this is then the creation that was already in place, all of humanity that had waited and tried to find this oneness with God, but they still hadn't found what they were looking for. And then Paul says, because the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope. So Paul is saying this about the old creation, which is first-tier consciousness. He's saying that that group of people through time was subject to futility, not willingly. What in the world is he talking about? He's sure not talking about the planet Earth. If we go back to the very beginning with Adam, how was Adam subjected to futility? He was given a commandment, "Thou shalt not." And within that commandment, boundary-based world, his self was delineated more clearly in its understanding, but it also saw God as other. And the futility is that what Adam had, he lost. Then when we come to Moses and the law and the commandments are increased, all of Israel was put under what Jesus called a heavy yoke. What was the heavy yoke? The heavy yoke was that from the self on the basis of doing, a person attempted through obedience to commandments, keeping sacred rituals and practices and sacred days of the week and doing everything right, doing, one could hopefully be pleasing to God, who was still seen as other. And that was the best identity it could be. And what was it then that subjected that creation, if you will, to futility? Who gave the law? Moses delivered it, but God gave it. Even in Adam's disobedience, Adam could never have been removed from the garden in the metaphor if a commandment, thou shalt not, had not been given to him. The source of commandment was God. And yet the commandment, Paul says, is the very thing that caused his death in the end. Well, that was because Paul had now evolved to a place where he realized keeping commandments, creeds, dogmas, and doctrines were not going to put him in a relationship with God that God intended. But they were necessary, as commandments are necessary to raise a child, and therefore we trace the source of this evolutionary track, if you will, all the way back to God as the source. God's the source of first tier. Adam wasn't a mistake. None of what happened in first tier was a mistake. It was a necessary learning experience. Then Paul goes on to say that the creation itself is going to be delivered from its bondage into glorious liberty. Bondage is what happens in first tier. When I was solely a blue meme in that level of consciousness, I was in bondage to that level of consciousness. Why? Because I couldn't see or understand anybody else's viewpoint except my own. And so I was in bondage. And I was in bondage to the way my consciousness was operating. And then Paul makes this statement, for we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pangs right now. That's what's happening. And not only is the creation, but we ourselves are groaning, waiting for the redemption of our body. The first fruits were modeling the fact that birth pangs were happening. What happens in birth pangs? Would we relate birth pangs to a situation that was intended to go on for the rest of a person's life? A woman who's 9 months pregnant thinks that. A woman who's 9 months pregnant thinks, I'm going to always be pregnant. This baby's never going to come. But that's not what birth pangs signal. Birth pangs relates to transformative thinking. A transformation is going to happen. We have something that exists, but it's going to be born into its fullness. The first fruits represent the birth pangs of all creation back to Adam. Through the transforming work of Jesus, being birthed into a global human, one new man. And Paul talks about one new man, and he specifically says that Jesus came to bring down the boundaries between Jew and Gentile, between people who looked at each other as the other, so that he might create one new man. And that's what's happening in the birth pangs. In fact, you know how we talked in earlier sessions about Matthew, Mark, and Luke and Jesus' apocalyptic sayings, and how Jesus said that all of his coming, the last days, all of that was going to happen within their generation. He also says about that time that these are the days of birth pains. So Paul isn't just originating this idea that the first fruit body was purely a birthing body, that transform right in the middle of our diagram, it's the womb, it's the birth sac. And Paul knew that because he got it from Jesus. And Paul knew his purpose was to come and to reveal Jesus. So that allows us to now enter into the co-creative phase of formlessness, but yet leaves us with a couple big questions. And that is, what are we saying then? What do we do? Do we walk in today on Sunday and announce to everybody that's in a church that there's no more church, and what do we do? Do we have community? If we do have community, what is community? How does that work in the formless? That's what we're going to address in our next and final section when we talk about formlessness and moving beyond Christianity and moving beyond the church and religion. So thanks a lot for joining me for all these, and I would ask anybody again that has any questions you'd like to address, please send them to info@presence.tv. We're going to be addressing these in the future in podcasts that we'll be posting to our presence.tv website. So other than that, I hope you have a great day out there. Thanks for joining me. I will see you the next time.